We're beginning Chapter 12 of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobson. Studies and Observation Groups. SOG. The Walter Reed amputee ward was a devastating sight to behold. Billy Waugh was now one of its patients, his right leg in a cast. The infection wasn't getting any better, and the doctor said part of his leg would likely need to be amputated, cut off below the knee. Day in and day out, Waugh watched fellow soldiers in the ward come and go. They'd get wheeled away to surgical rooms and return without an arm or a leg. The way Waugh saw it, there were two categories of amputees. Some soldiers became a shell of their former selves after they lost a limb. Others somehow managed to keep things light, like Sergeant Major in the next bed over, who recently had his lower leg removed. Waugh went with him to the Friday night dance. "Watch this," the Sergeant Major said, unhooking his prosthetic leg and putting it on backward, so the foot faced in reverse. The soldier with the prosthetic asked a pretty girl to dance, and she said sure. But while they were dancing, she looked down at his backward foot, screamed, and ran away. The Sergeant Major howled with laughter. Waugh didn't know which was worse, to lose a limb or to find humor in it. Soon enough, Arthur Metz, chief of lower extremity amputation surgery, came to give Billy Waugh the bad news. Despite 2 surgeries and 4 weeks of antibiotics, the infection in his right leg had gotten worse. Dr. Metz proposed amputating the foot from the ankle down. If it got any worse, they might have to take the bottom half of the leg. Waugh could not bear the thought. "I had it in my mind to return to combat," he says. "In 1965, you couldn't fight without a foot." Billy Waugh pleaded with Dr. Metz to be discharged. He wanted to go heal at his sister's house in Texas. Dr. Metz agreed and wrote him a convalescence leave orders. Waugh was thrilled at first, but as he prepared to travel to Texas, hope gave way to misery. He missed being a soldier and the intensity of war. Something came over him, and, penicillin bottle in hand, he decided to hitchhike to Vietnam as a standby passenger on military aircraft. It seemed the pilots felt sorry for him with his long cast on his right leg and never had to wait long. In less than a week, he made it from Washington, D.C., to Travis Air Force Base outside San Francisco, to the Philippines, and finally to Tan Son Nhat Airport in Saigon. Saigon was a busy city in the summer of 1965. Waugh checked into the Hotel Majestic and headed to the Tudu Bar down the street, the place where soldiers went for rest and relaxation. It didn't take long for Waugh to spot 2 friends from Special Forces, Billy Kessinger, a medic, and Danny Horton, a communications man. Seated at a corner table, the trio of Green Berets began chatting. After a few beers, Kessinger and Horton hinted to Waugh about a highly classified direct action unit that was just now expanding. An elite unconventional warfare group that was secreted inside MACV. No one outside the unit knew about it. It was a special access covert program called Studies and Observations Group, SOG, named to deceive people into thinking its members were Ivy League type analysts reading reports. In reality, the missions were so dangerously insane, Kessinger and Horton said the acronym was translated to Suicide on the Ground by Some Guys. Kessinger and Horton were already in Special Observation Group, and they showed Waugh their credentials, a photo of a few coded letters, and a telephone number that you could call 24/7 if you ever needed anything. Special Observation Group's members had unprecedented authority. They could go anywhere in South Vietnam at any time of the night or day. No getting stopped by military police. If you were in Special Observations Group, you were authorized to carry a firearm at all times. Kessinger and Horton called the creds a wow pass because you could walk on water with it. Sitting and drinking at the Tudu Bar, the men talked late into the night, past curfew for American soldiers. When an American military police approached the table and asked for identification, Kessinger and Horton flashed their wow passes. Waugh pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, unfolded it, and it showed the military police his convalescent leave orders. "What the hell are you doing on convalescent leave in Vietnam, Master Sergeant William D. Waugh?" the military police asked, reading from the papers. "I'm visiting with my amigos," says Waugh. The military police was not certain what to make of the situation. So he called his commanding officer, who asked if Master Sergeant Waugh was causing problems. The military police said he wasn't. The commanding officer said convalescent leave orders were good and Waugh could be left alone. The night ended without incident. A week later, Waugh returned to America, more determined than ever to get himself assigned to the classified unconventional warfare unit called Special Observation Group. In Washington, D.C., he traveled to the Pentagon to meet with the assignments officer for Special Forces, a woman named Billie Alexander. Seated across from her, Waugh pleaded to be assigned to her MACV SOG. All she could do was laugh, he recalls. She said I could barely walk. How did I expect to ever fight again? Waugh proposed a challenge. If he was able to convince Dr. Metz to reassign him to Special Forces at Fort Bragg, and if he could last there for a month of training, would Billie Alexander recommend him for Special Observation Group? Perhaps she felt sorry for me, Waugh remembers, because she looked at me for a while and then said yes. Waugh met with Dr. Metz, who rejected his idea. His lower leg was beyond salvage, Metz said, and required amputation. Waugh begged to undergo one last exploratory surgery. The doctor agreed. During the surgery, Dr. Metz went far into the leg, near the knee, where he located a tiny sliver of Waugh's army boot lodged inside the tibia. This was likely the source of the months-long infection. Once it was removed, the final round of penicillin took hold and Waugh began to heal. The following month, he returned to Fort Bragg. In his second week back in Special Forces, he received new orders. He was being sent to Vietnam as part of MACV Special Observation Group. The reason for Special Observation Group's highly classified nature was that it violated the Geneva Agreement of 1962, the Declaration of Neutrality of Laos, which forbade U.S. forces from operating inside the country. But at the Pentagon, after almost 2 years of reading reports from intelligence assets in the field, the Defense Department was coming around to the idea that Laos was key to the insurgency and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the locus of the problem. Now, President Johnson needed convincing. The initial job of Special Observation Group reconnaissance men would be to sneak into Laos, take photographs of activity on the trail, plant listening devices, and get out alive with all the evidence. Eventually, they would be assigned cross-border missions into Cambodia as well. Nobody knew with certainty what was in Laos, says John Plaster, a former member of the classified unit. Learning what was there was Special Observation Group's new operation. Plaster is considered one of the most competent snipers out there, and his experiences in the MACV's Special Observation Group would later serve as the basis for part of the video game called Call of Duty: Black Ops. Special Observation Group's first chief was Colonel Donald Blackburn, the former leader of Operation White Star, and he prepared his fighters for battle in Laos that would be decidedly ungentlemanly. Blackburn was a master of guerrilla warfare. During World War II, he led kill or be killed missions in the Philippines, where the tribesmen he organized into a guerrilla fighting force turned out to be headhunters. Blackburn's wartime diary became a best-selling book in 1955 called Blackburn's Headhunters. In Laos, Special Observation Group operators would need to employ ruthless, unconventional warfare tactics with unmerciful intensity to direct Special Observation Group operations on the ground. Colonel Blackburn chose another guerrilla warfare legend, the Finnish-born Larry Thorne. MACV's Special Observation Group started with just 16 volunteers, all Green Berets who'd been training on Okinawa. The men worked out of a forward operating base in Kham Duc, a border village located 60 miles southwest of Da Nang, similar to the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program and the OSS Jedburghs before that. Each Special Observation Group team was made up of 2 or 3 American soldiers and 9 tribesmen. Initially, the tribesmen were Hmong and ethnic Chinese minority. Later they included Montagnards, indigenous people from Vietnam's Central Highlands, whom the Americans called Yards. We Americans had advanced technology, such as helicopters, and the tribesmen had ancient techniques, such as silent ambush, explains John Plaster. The tribesmen helped the Green Berets understand the tactics that were being used by the North Vietnamese guerrilla fighters. Things not found in any manual. For example, Hmong tribesmen demonstrated how, by digging a 4-foot hole into a hillside, a fighter could see and feel the vibrations of an advancing aircraft long before ears could register the engine sound. Shared tricks of the trade went both ways. Tribesmen were also recruited to watch and count enemy troops and supplies being moved through the jungle, because most could not read or write English or Vietnamese. The CIA's technical staff and non-literate system of conveyance. Instead of words, the counting devices given out to recruits featured tiny programs representing men, weapons, vehicles, even elephants. A common means of transportation in the region. When the recruits activated a toggle switch on the device, their data was transmitted to CIA aircraft flying overhead. Unlike the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program, the bond between the tribesmen and the Special Observation Group operators were reported to be strong. The Nung and Yards could have cared less about South Vietnam as a country, recalls Plaster. They felt no allegiance to some abstract paymaster like the United States. But they were ready to die for their recon teammates, American and Yard alike. Right. Special Observation Group's first cross-border mission into Laos occurred on October 18th, 1965. U.S. Ambassador William Sullivan forbade Special Observation Group from using helicopter insertions into the supposedly neutral country. So the first team to go in, Reconnaissance Team Iowa, was inserted by helicopter into the Vietnam side of the border. They walked through the jungle into Laos. The team leader, or 1-0, was Master Sergeant Charles Slats, Petrie. The assistant team leader, or 1-1, was Sergeant First Class Willie Card. Together, these two Americans led 7 Nung mercenaries and 1 lieutenant from the South Vietnam Army, ARVN, to gather reconnaissance of enemy activity along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Rather than oversee the mission from Con Duc, Larry Thorne flew his men in the helicopter, circling overhead until he received word they'd successfully crossed over into Laos. Each Special Observation Group team wore Asian-made uniforms with no labels or insignia. They carried sterile weapons, meaning they came with no identifying marks, such as Swedish K submachine gun, and they smoked Chinese cigarettes. If anyone got captured in Laos, no one could identify them as Americans. Special Observation Group operators were issued unmarked Special Observation Group Bowie-style knives with 6-inch blades, designed by Ben Barker on Okinawa and secretly manufactured in Japan. Not since the days of the OSS had the U.S. military issued stiletto knives. Overhead air support was critical to the success of every mission. The H-34 King Bee helicopter was Special Observation Group's signature aircraft, a bubble-nosed workhorse able to withstand a hail of automatic weapon fire and keep flying. The King Bees were flown by South Vietnamese Air Force pilots trained in Texas by the CIA. With radio call signs like Cowboy and Mustachio, these pilots saved countless Special Observation Group men from capture or death, performing radical jungle infiltration, exfiltration, and rescue operations day after day. All gave some gave all, says Special Observation Group operator John Stryker Meyer of the King Bee pilots. Cessna aircraft were also used regularly on missions, and flying on the first mission in a Cessna 02 spotter were U.S. Air Force Major Harley Piles and U.S. Marine Corps Captain Winfield Sisson. If anything went wrong, the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy were on standby, ready to send in covert air support in the form of overhead airstrikes. Reconnaissance Team Iowa was inserted successfully, and after a few hours, they radioed Larry and said they'd crossed the border into Laos. Thorne radioed ComDuc to say he was now heading back to base. He was never heard from again. In the first few minutes of Special Observation Group's classified border operations, The program swallowed up one of its finest officers and a whole King Bee helicopter, says John Plaster. That afternoon, the Cessna, carrying Major Piles and Captain Sisson, disappeared. On Special Observation Group's first mission, 3 men went missing in action, never to be seen again. It was an indication of the kind of catastrophic loss Special Observation Group would face over the next 6 years. The great majority of such cases are either still classified or lack records, said to have been lost. Over the next 8 months, 5 Special Observation Group's recon teams working out of Konduк conducted 48 cross-border missions. In the winter of 1966, MACV headquarters opened a second Special Observation Group base up north, and Khe Sanh, closer to the demilitarized zone. Still limping from the gunshot wounds to the leg, Billy Waugh arrived there in May. Located in the northeast corner of South Vietnam, Khe Sanh was the most remote American military facility in all the South. A strip or flat surrounded by 4,000-foot mountains and treacherous ravines. Much of the activity centered around Khao Roc Mountain, a 2,000-foot limestone peak visible from the base, as were Hill 1050 and Hill 950. Veritable beehives of North Vietnamese activity, the geography here was unlike anything in the United States. Endless karst limestone outcroppings that looked like giant vine-covered chimneys. The base camp, under the control of the U.S. Marine Corps, was strategically located just 14 miles south of the DMZ and 12 miles east of the border of Laos. For Special Observation Group, this meant that Khe Sanh was within striking distance of key enemy bases alongside the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Special Observation Group base at Khe Sanh was a special access facility partitioned behind concertina wire, surrounded by blast walls, and built mostly underground. Special Observation Group operations were classified, which meant that even Khe Sanh's Marine commander, Colonel David E. Lowndes, wasn't privy to his activities. In 1966, when Waugh arrived, the new Special Observation Group chief was Jack Sing Laub, former OSS Jedburgh, who ran covert CIA airdrop operations during the Korean War, under the Covert Joint Advisory Commission, Korea, or JAC. There was no rest at Special Observation Group, remembers Billy Waugh. Only war, recon, rescue, sleep. International law meant nothing to the enemy out here on the border region between Vietnam and Laos. A concept Special Observation Group men were regularly forced to grapple with. Despite the covert nature of their missions, Special Forces soldiers operated under the U.S. military chain of command and were bound by the laws of war. Ever since the Lieber Code of 1863, the execution of captured prisoners and the mutilation of dead soldiers' body on the battlefield were expressly forbidden. In 1949, the Geneva Convention updated these protocols for the modern era. And yet, look at what the North Vietnamese Army had done to Sergeant Donald Sain, thought Billy Waugh as he flew over Khao Roc Mountain in a Special Observation Group observation aircraft. It was June 1966. Reconnaissance Team Montana had been ambushed 3 days before, with 2 Special Observation Group men captured and executed, and 7 Indigs killed in action or missing in action. 10 Henry Whalen made it back to Kaesong and gave the ambush location coordinates to Special Observation Group commanders. Hua was put in charge of rescue or retrieval mission, which is why he was across the border in Laos now, searching for dead bodies from the Cessna. When he spotted Sergeant Donald Sane's body in the jungle clearing, he felt contempt and disgust. Don Sane was a 23-year-old kid from Santa Clara County, California, who'd worn a white tuxedo and a bow tie to prom just a few years before. Now, he was not just dead, but had been mutilated and put on display by the North Vietnamese Army. Sane's captors had killed him and arranged him in a spread eagle position with his legs staked into the earth and his arms tied to a tree. Maggots were crawling around the gunshot wounds that Don Sane had taken to the chest. Once vibrant and full of life, he was now carrion. It was 9 a.m., and Hua assessed the situation. I'd been in combat long enough to know Sane's body was not only displayed so we could see it, but it had to be booby-trapped as well, he recalls. Hua instructed the pilot to head back to the Special Observation Group base at Kaesong. There, he briefed his commanding officer. After putting together a bright light rescue team, the Special Observation Group men returned to the clearing in the jungle. The team included Danny Horton, the communications man from the Tudu Bar, Sergeant First Class James Craig, a medic, and Major General Jerry Kilburn, the most senior officer in the group and a POW during the Korean War. Flying the H-34 King Bee was South Vietnamese Air Force pilot Nguyen Van Hoang, call sign Mustachio, so named after Clark Gable-style mustache he wore. Once during a rescue operation and under heavy fire, Mustachio was struck in the neck with a bullet while piloting a King Bee over a target. He plugged the bullet hole with his fingers and got the crippled helicopter 20 kilometers back to Kaesong, flying with only one hand. What a legend. With Mustachio at the controls, the King Bee hovered over Sane's body, while Hua tried to figure out how to get a hold of it without being hit by grenade frag. Mustachio searched for a landing zone. North Vietnamese Army were everywhere, and the time was critical. Body retrieval was the perfect time for an ambush. Mustachio circled around a few times before setting the King Bee down. Roughly 100 meters from the body, the rescue team hopped off. Approaching the body, Billy Hua felt anger and disgust return. The stench of the rotting flesh was hard to bear. He grabbed a climbing rope and told Major Kilburn his plan. I decided to tie one end of the rope to the wheel of Mustachio's helicopter and the other end to Sane's leg. That way we'd move the body and let the booby traps explode harmlessly, Hua recalls. The team looked at Hua like he was crazy. There was no manual for this kind of horrid shit, he says. The rope was the fastest and most efficient way to achieve the objective. Hua tied the rope to the helicopter wheel and instructed Mustachio to hover over Sane delicately, so as not to set off the grenades. He tied the rope around Sane's leg. "Let's move out," he told the team. Everyone stepped back a few yards. Using the helicopter, Mustachio pulled the body off the ground. 3 or 4 booby-trap grenades started going off around Sane. Sane was hovering above us, by his leg, remembers Hua. The fluids and maggots and crap from his body poured out as he was being lifted up and away. And as it did, Kilburn got sprayed with debris. Kilburn, a highly decorated combat veteran, had sustained 3 years of torture at the hands of his communist captors in the Korean War. But this was too much for him. When the fluids hit Kilburn, he screamed. Mustachio lifted Sane's body and set it down. Kilburn finished screaming. Everyone got quiet. Sane's body had been recovered. But there was more work to do. A second Special Observation Group man from Reconnaissance Team Montana was still missing. A kid from Missouri named Sergeant Delmer Lee, Outlaw Laws. The Bright Light team searched the area, trying to find a blood trail and maybe Laws. The Special Observation Group men divvied up ground. Each man assigned a quadrant to score. This part of the jungle was hostile and unforgiving, filled with poisonous snakes like the two-step snake. If it bit you, you had 2 steps left in you before you died. Wah found himself waist-high in wait-a-minute bushes, prickly plants with claws the sharpness of a cat's that hooked into your skin when you passed by. If you got snagged, you had to wait a minute to unhook yourself or get torn to shreds. After several hours of searching, everyone's fatigues were ripped up, arms and faces scratched up and bleeding, but no one was ready to stop yet. They intended to find Outlaw. Danny Horton called out. He found a blood trail. Wah saw Horton emerge from the woods, looking ill. In one hand, he carried an American jungle boot. Something grotesque was sticking out of the shoe, recalls Wah. As he figured out what he was looking at, part of Delmer Law's leg, Danny Horton took to the ground where he found it. He'd been mostly eaten by a tiger, says Wah. The ride back to the Special Operation Group's base was quiet. Beneath the helicopter, Sane's body was swinging from a rope. Delmer Law's leg was lying on the floor of the helicopter in a plastic body bag. Once they landed on the tarmac at Kaesong, Billy Wah climbed out of the helicopter carrying Law's leg in the bag. My clothes were shredded. I was filthy, covered in horrible things. My arms and face were scratched. I smelled, he recalled, standing there on the tarmac waiting for the Special Observation Group Bright Light team, was an officer from the 5th Special Forces, taking a break from his desk duties at MACV headquarters in Nha Trang, remembers Wah. He asked me to come inside. Wah followed his superior officer into the Special Observation Group's base. The officer began yelling at him. "God damn it, Wah," he said. "You're filthy. You smell. You're out of uniform. You're a disgrace, all of you." Wah set the plastic bag on the table. He took a moment before he spoke. Every soldier knows chain of command. Every soldier respects authority. Your superior officer is always correct. But Wah could not contain himself. He took Law's leg out of the body bag and set it on the table. "How about him?" Wah asked, pointing. "Is he a disgrace?" The officer stared at the jungle boot and the bloody stump. "What the hell is that?" he asked. "It's Sergeant Delmer Lee Law's leg," said Wah. "The rest of him got eaten by a tiger. Is he out of uniform, sir?" The officers grew quiet, apologized, and left. The following week, a box arrived at Kaesong from headquarters in Nha Trang. Inside, there were 3 boxes of crisp, new jungle fatigues. No markings, of course. No one could know Special Observation Group operations were violating the Declaration on the Neutrality of Laos. Uh-oh. Always fucking up, guys. Anyways, until next time.